Hi y'all, it is Fissa here, and before we get into today's episode, I do want to talk to you guys about two videos that were released after I finished recording and that I think you guys should check out when you're done listening here. So both videos are by the YouTuber Khadija Mbowe. The first one is called Critical Race Theory, a beginner's guide, where she talks about the history, the origins of critical race theory, as well as explaining what exactly it is. And then the second video, which is a continuation or follow up to the first video, is titled Who Benefits from All This Outrage and Division, where she talks about nuance and moral panics, which I think really ties into the message I was trying to get across in this podcast episode. She touches on things that, I wish I had expressed in this episode, but that is why I am sending you guys to check her out. I will link both of the videos in the show notes so you guys can check them out. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode.
Sanbanan Dumlang, hello, it's Simply Spissa here, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast, Simply Do the Work. If you're not yet subscribed to the podcast, please do so, and remember to share it with your friends and family, and also feel free to reach out to me at Simply Spissa on Instagram and Twitter. So before I get into today's episode, I want to apologize if you guys do hear any background noises. They're currently working in our garden. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. So today's episode is titled Shouldn't Christians Be Woke? And now, I'm not saying that everyone who engages in social justice work and everyone who is quote unquote woke needs to be a Christian, but I do believe that all Christians should engage in social justice work. So let me start off by telling you guys a story. So it's a Sunday afternoon. I'm home alone because I'm studying, and my family went shopping for groceries. And they come back, and while unpacking these groceries, I noticed that they came back with Joy magazine. Now, Joy magazine, for those who don't know, is a very popular South African Christian magazine. And what caught my eye was a headline on the cover that read, "How should a Christian view being woke?" And this was the feature article. There was another article in that edition called "Should I Be Woke? Virtues of Cultural Engagement, Courage Applied" by Tendai Chitsike. And so before I even read these articles, I had a feeling it's gonna be mess. It's gonna be mess because of the specific type of Christianity that Joy magazine promotes. I'm gonna spare you guys ears the details of because I just browsed through that issue, and there's just a lot of mess. Some of the other articles are just I can't even repeat what they wrote because wow. But both of these articles, right, about being woke, they just to summarize what they were saying that Christians shouldn't really engage in social justice work because God cares more about the heart, and that all people are inherently evil regardless of race. They also argue that Christians shouldn't worry about racial identities because they find identity in Christ. And I want to read you guys a quote from the article, one of the articles, which I think summarizes what they were trying to say. And so it reads, as author Scott Allen wrote, "The crying need today is to recover a biblical orthodox approach to justice and cultural engagement. Unbiblical ideas have to be exposed and rejected, replaced by a uniquely Christian and biblical approach to social and cultural transformation that is gospel-centered and known for its grace, forgiveness, and civility. One that treats all people as unique individuals, not mouthpieces of identity groups. One that understands that all evil is rooted in human hearts and not in capitalism, white supremacy, or the patriarchy. One that sees people as free, responsible, accountable, moral agents, and not as victims or oppressors." Close quote. And that is a whole other mess. Literally, that quote alone just tells me that this ain't it. And the thing is, right, one would assume that maybe this was written by a white cishet man, but this article was written by a black man, which I found quite interesting, like specifically in his article, Mr. Chitsike denies the value of people's lived experiences, which now I think a point which I do want to say, right? Something just fell. Unlived experiences, right? Yes, lived experiences are very important, right? They do help to share. It's important for us to share our stories, but also lived experiences isn't the beginning and the end of social justice work, right? Like, for example, just because I'm black and queer, that doesn't make me automatically an expert on issues surrounding race, sexuality, and gender, right? That's why it's important to also back up my lived experiences with sort of like doing the reading and knowing the history, right? Which I think is something that he didn't address in his article. And he also argues against progressive Christians without naming them by saying that his belief in Jesus is based on historical, objective facts and not because Jesus was a marginalized individual, which one can argue, what are these historical objective facts he's speaking of? Like, is he solely relying on the Bible as a historical and objective point of view? Because we can go down a whole entire rabbit hole how there's certain stories in the Bible that just actually did not happen, and how certain stories in the Bible, if you look at them within their context, were more like myths, or they were more like I'm trying to think of this another word. Inganegwan. I'm trying to think of the Zulu word inganegwan, also like a way to understand the world, how the people of the Bible of that time were trying to understand the world from with the knowledge that they had, and also from their experiences, right? How I feel like we also can't just take the Bible and try to force its ideals on into our modern 21st century world. And also this idea that people are only supporting Jesus because he's marginalized, because we talk about how the Israelites were under oppression by the Romans during the New Testament time, and they thought that Jesus was going to be they're emancipated, and they said no, that's not the point. But I feel like I'm not articulating myself as well as I would like. But what I'm trying to say is, right, for example, if I as a black queer person look at the story of Jesus and I see myself reflected in that, I'm not necessarily saying that this is I'm not saying, for example, like, I'm not saying that Jesus was queer in the same way that I am. I'm not saying that Jesus' experiences mirrors exactly mine, but it's sort of, for me, I find that by looking at scripture through that lens, right, of my various identities, I'm able to actually engage in it much better than trying to follow the very pervasive Eurocentric, or very white evangelical Christianity that a lot of us are exposed to, right? Like, it's a whole lot of mess. It's like, I don't even know how does one begin to unpack this, but it's very clear that someone like me is not the target audience for these articles. I also do want to say that this does not represent all Christians, but it is definitely the most pervasive kind of Christianity in our society. And if you think like that, like if you have the same views as like that author, I really don't know what to say to you. Like I don't know what to say to you. Like I really actually I don't want to engage with you because I don't see how we could have a fruitful conversation unless if if you're open to questioning, you're open to listening, then I have some thoughts. So firstly, activists or social justice warriors or the woke aren't a monolith, right? Within any movement, there will be different views and opinions on things. In the same way how within Christianity, there are so many different ways in which people practice the Christianity, so many different views. Like there's over 100 denominations, if I'm not mistaken. Please fact check me on that. But just because people like me like to emphasize dismantling of systems, that doesn't mean individuals are absolved of any responsibility. In fact, changing the hearts and minds of people is part of the work that needs to be done. But it's not just people changing for the sake of changing, right? It's changing so that when people and individuals have changed their hearts and minds, then we come together and we can change the systems. Because I feel like there's the way in which like these articles presented, it just stop at changing people and that will bring justice, which is not how I see it, right? And also, like, whether you're privileged or not, or you're marginalized, life happens to us all, right? And nothing is clear cut in stone. And what I'm trying to say here is that, just because, right, for example, I'm part of, marginalized groups, doesn't mean that I am forever oppressed, right? Like I said, in my Young Royals video on YouTube, I was talking about how, queer people's lives aren't defined by the queerphobia, the homophobia, transphobia that is directed at us. So there's so much more to our lives, and it kind of can be dehumanizing just, to just look at the work that people are doing for social justice and just reduce it to simply, oh, there's victims and there's oppressors, right? Like I'm no victim. I'm nobody's victim. I don't know about y'all, right? And when I say nothing is clear cut in stone, it's like there's so much nuance, right? I feel like so much nuance that these articles do not explore, and they have such a condescending tone, as if they are it's a very paternalistic, like we are the authoritative, we have the authoritative, like to the final factor. Like I think they, as if they, like, who died and made them king? I don't even know what I'm trying, like, Isingisi is beating me today. But I also find their articles a little bit hypocritical. Like, you can't tell me that an issue like racism is because of people's hearts being in the wrong. Yes, it is, part of that, but I'm not disenfranchised because white people simply hate black people, right? It's because of the history of white people from Europe coming to South Africa and colonizing my ancestors, stripping them of their right to humanity, and also indoctrinating them with a Eurocentric Christianity, which was a way to force black people into submission, force them to become docile. Laws exist all around the world that unfairly discriminate against black people, and simply changing people's hearts and minds isn't gonna free us. Now, I will say, there were certain points within these articles that I kind of agreed with, that I like, okay, I see what you're trying to say, but I think just because of the context in which they were written, and I think just the greater argument they're trying to make, I can't say, I fully subscribe, I fully endorse their like message, but I agree when they say that laws alone won't rid the issue of racism, right? But their strategy of simply moral persuasion and conversion to Christianity isn't going to solve the problems either. History teaches us that the racial progress we have today isn't from moral persuasion or changing people's hearts, but rather it was the work of activists organizing, right? Legislations being made. And I also want to just briefly highlight that theology from black pastors, played a crucial role in the racial progress that is seen in America, and that also actually influenced the work of many South African anti-apartheid activists. And I think that just goes to show how it's very diverse, right? The work that people are doing, and the just people's, even the way people interpret scripture, right? And so I feel like the way they interpret this is very dangerous. It's very us versus them mentality. But I want to tell you guys another story, and before I continue, I do want to put I do want to say like a trigger warning / content warning, because I will be talking about a police shooting, specifically the case of Amber Geiger, who shot Botham John back in 2019. So now's your time to click out if that is triggering for you. And I do want to say like that podcast kind of, while preparing this episode, like it kind of gets like the mood drops from here on out from here on, but I feel like this is very important to highlight, to speak about. And so just to set the scene, right, this was a few days after seeing that article. I was watching a sermon with my family, and the pastor was talking about mercy, and he was talking about various biblical and present day stories of mercy. And I was like, even though I don't subscribe to that church's doctrine, like, I'm no longer an active member of the church, but I was like, I see some of the points he was making when we talk about mercy. But where he lost me was when he brought up the Amber Geiger murder trial. So for those of you unfamiliar with this case, What happened was in 2019, Amber Geiger, a white female officer, shot an unarmed black man, Botham John, in his home because she thought she was in her own flat and he was an intruder. And so that case was filled with there's a lot of controversy around that case. The police officers were accused of being corrupt, tampering with evidence, and even I believe one of the witnesses passed away, was killed in a very violent death. And so when Amber was at her sentencing trial, Brant John, the 18-year-old brother of Botham at the time, he was 18 at the time, told Amber that he forgives her and asked to give her a hug. And then the judge, I didn't write down her name, sorry about that. The judge, who was a black woman, also hugged Amber and then gifted her with a Bible and basically ministered to her, saying you should get saved, you should start reading John 3 verse 16. And this is honestly a horrific story. Like, my heart breaks for the John family. My heart even broke further when I was looking into, because he just mentioned it and then he continued his sermon, and I was like, whoa, wait, I need to do some more reading, because I was vaguely familiar with the case. And I must say, the way he just dropped this horrific story in his sermon and tried to paint it as a feel-good template for how we should be merciful to others, it didn't make me feel good, not gonna lie. And it doesn't surprise me, though, that a white pastor preaching to a majority white congregation would interpret the story like this. In episode 23 of this podcast, I briefly mentioned that such public displays, right, bother me. Like, I think one of the words I say is like, you can't hug away racism or sing kumbaya. I can't remember my exact word, but something along those lines. But I want to add to those sentiments, in case they weren't clear, that the Jean family in this case, they aren't wrong, right? The Jean family definitely do not deserve any criticism, because they are really trying to do their best to navigate this tragedy with the tools that they have. Like, Brant was 18 years old and he just lost his brother in a horrific way. Like, I can't even imagine how do you even process such a thing, right? And even like, I was going back to the commentary that was made in 2019 during this time, and it was quite divisive, right? There were some people who were criticizing Brant for publicly announcing his forgiveness for this woman, right? They felt like it was very performative. But I'm kind of empathetic, right? I feel like him and his family, like the Jean family, they shouldn't have to carry the weight of racial justice, right? Like, in that moment, they're mourning a loss. They're complex human beings who are dealing with a very devastating situation, so they shouldn't have to in that moment be thinking, just all like, how is this gonna look, the optics, like I think also you understand a lot of times when you talk about forgiveness, right, it's also something that you do for yourself, right, to try to free yourself from pain, from suffering. And so that is just my thoughts on that. But I do want to say, though, that the judge, right, actually, let me just quickly Google her name. I feel bad just calling her the judge. Tammy Kemp. Okay, Tammy Kemp. Judge Tammy Kemp. Excuse me. Judge Tammy Kemp, I'm looking at her a little bit like, girl, what were you doing? Because in that moment, she was acting in a professional manner, right? Like, in that moment, you are acting in your professional capacity. And I remember I read a letter that was written by an atheist organization who were filing a complaint, saying that it's one thing for Jean, who is a private citizen, in that in that case, right, for him to basically make this public declaration and to express his feelings in that moment, like, that's okay. But Judge Tammy, like, you are acting as an official of the state, right? And there is like a law in America about the separation of church and state, and so they felt like she violated that, which I also think it was maybe she got like overcome by the moment, or the spirit moved, as Christians say. But I think it sets a bad precedent, and I think this also brings into conversation about what is religious freedom? What does religious freedom mean? And funny enough, that very same, like the July issue of the Joy magazine, also had a short feature on religious freedom. And I don't know, I just sometimes feel like Christians don't truly want religious freedom. They just want the freedom to practice their religion, right? And it doesn't matter if that infringes on other people's beliefs, because it was weird. But taking a deeper look into this situation made me realize that it was kind of like a wake-up call for me, that I need to be careful not to lose sight of people's humanity, right? Like in the case of, the Jean family, a lot of people were simply looking at them as a symbol, right? And not as people who are going through this very traumatic incident, right? Like while I'm trying to navigate how we must dismantle oppressive systems that dehumanize, I shouldn't dehumanize people in the process, and while using people's stories or dramas or real life experiences, I shouldn't lose sight of their complexity as humans, because the John family are still dealing with this loss till today. And I'm sure they don't appreciate liberals or progressives picking apart at their pain and criticizing them. But I'm sure they don't appreciate being propped up as some template for mercy. But I don't know, right? So as I mentioned, after the service, I took time to research this case. And I found out that recently, in April this year, Amber tried to appeal her sentence of 10 years. And the Jean family made it clear that they're against this appeal. And they spoke out about the corruption that was done by the police investigating this case, and how they feel like justice wasn't really served. And I think we definitely need to have conversations about what justice actually looks like. For me, it's not the current judicial system that we have right now. This trial happened in the US, but even here in South Africa, our policing and courts are flawed because of the history and foundation it was built on, right? The police were basically, in South Africa, their job was to keep the black people, under submission to the white people, right? To make sure that black people do not go into white spaces, to make sure that the white people and their interests are kept safe. And the truth is, it's not even the citizens. It was more about protecting the power of the state, right? I saw a tweet just before I started filming that was talking about how it's so funny how, right, in South Africa, we've been crying out about the issue of gender-based violence and the high crime rates, and there's been no action. But as soon as businesses and capital was under threat, when there was the unrest and the looting, the South African National Defence Force and the police were armed and ready. And people were commenting saying, but it's very clear that the police is not there for citizens. Citizens, we are the last resort. And I think that's what I mean. It's like, we need to question, what does justice mean? Because having people locked up, is that truly justice? Like, if you've gone through a terrible ordeal, does that help you to pick up the pieces of your life and carry on? But yeah, it's just something for all of us to think about, because I don't really have the answers. I'm still trying to navigate this, and just I'm constantly reading and listening to what others are saying. And I'm sure you've got a lot to think about, and I know it's easy to talk, but the greatest challenge will be actually living a life that benefits others and uplifts the marginalized. Like, I'm definitely feeling convicted about not taking enough action, and I'm striving to do better, and I hope you find the strength to do this work with me. And so, on that note, thank you so much for tuning in again. And if you did enjoy this episode, please do share it with your friends and family. And also, of course, reach out to me at Simply Swiss on Instagram and Twitter. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I will link all the mentioned episodes in the show notes, and so you can check that out when you're done listening. And so until you hear from me in the next one, I love you so much. Mwah, mwah, mwah.